In this episode, Tom and Stephen are joined by Great Women in Compliance co-host Lisa Fine, who is a Buffalo, New York native and an uber Buffalo Bills fan, as we look at the Damar Hamlin injury from the leadership and crisis management perspective. Hello, everyone. Tom Fox back again with Stephen Martin and our special guest Lisa Fine for another episode of Sports and Compliance. Today, we're going to talk about Damar Hamlin and the incidents around his injury and really what it means for compliance, what it means for the viewing public, and probably a lot of personal feelings as well. And with that note, Lisa Fine is with us, and Lisa is a Buffalo native and a uber Buffalo Bills fan. So she's agreed to join us, known to the compliance community as the co-host of the Great Women in Compliance podcast on the Compliance Podcast Network. Lisa, I know you've gone through a roller coaster of emotions over this. You're very passionate about your Bills fanship. You're very passionate about Buffalo. I'm afraid to say there's probably not too many towns in America that have had the year or the past year Buffalo had. And so just tell us, as a fan, as a Buffalo native, what do the Bills mean to the team? What do the Bills mean to the city? And then what does all of this mean to you?
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me on to talk about this. The Bills, first of all, I don't live in Buffalo anymore. So I feel like a lot of this, while I'm feeling like it's still my hometown and a part of me, as are the Buffalo Bills. What people can't see is I'm wearing a t-shirt that says Choose Love, and it has a Buffalo Bills logo. This was one of the fundraisers from, I dressed up for the occasion. This was something I purchased earlier this year as part of the raising money and funds after the shootings in Buffalo that happened earlier this year. It's been a really tough year for the city, and I want to start with that because the Bills are the glue that always holds people together for Buffalo and always has been. I've joked, I've been a fan since the words wide right mean a lot to me. And growing up, this is just a part of who you are. Buffalo people, you have to be a combination of tough to deal with the weather, and we believe we're the city of good neighbors. And I try to take that wherever I go in life. And I've taken the Bills with me. So this year, with the expectations so high this year and just so exciting, and the team has built character. Sean McDermott has built a character of that team that is perfectly aligned with the city, but nobody has been prepared for what the last year has been, both for the city and then now for the team. That there was a great New York Times article. This is the fandom is also it's a piece of joy that you have no matter how they're doing. Your Bills Mafia wasn't always called Bills Mafia, but Bills Mafia becomes a part of your life. And so it's meant a huge deal for people in Buffalo. It just feels like another blow. And the reason I can talk about that too is my parents are in Florida part of the year. They're snowbirds. It's not also not an uncommon Buffalo thing. But I was with them Monday night. We were so excited all day to watch the game, had our shirts on, ready to go. And you just sit down and you're watching it and you're excited, then nervous, then they had 3 points. And then just seeing Damar Hamlin go down, it impacted everybody. And I'm sure we'll all talk about that. But just looking at it and realizing what was happening and then looking at the players. And somehow you start feeling like you know them. People like Josh Allen, when he walks around and says, ends any conversation with "Go Bills." These you could see that the protection and support, and then in some ways pride in our coach and our team for doing the right thing. So it's a very emotional roller coaster. It's not mine. In a way, I feel selfish for having it. But I mean, I did not sleep Monday night, and you're just engaged. Thank God today, watching some of that good news was really, it's hard to put into words. Running over to see, and a few minutes ago I saw online that Mitch Morse and Dane Jackson, who's another corner who's a close friend of his, were speaking. It was the first media availability, and just talking about people and telling people you love them and other things. It just made me, it's a lot to say, but it's just a little bit of how I feel.
Stephen, I know you played sports in high school and college. I played football into high school. You and I love football. We love college football. We love pro football. We love the physical nature of it. I have to admit that right up front. And it's a violent game. But should players risk not just their health, but is that a question we should be discussing now?
Before I tackle that question, I want to go back to Lisa and say how amazing it has been to watch Buffalo rally this year, but more important to watch the entire country rally around what happened the other night. From the fundraising and the charities, from the Bills and Bengals fans at the hospital to the coaches together to the teams, it's been pretty phenomenal to watch, and that's so amazing to see, and especially what sounds like very good news today for Damar Hamlin, because when I saw it on TV, I thought to myself, he may have just died on the field. Because when I saw the reaction, it was the first thing I said is he had a heart attack. I had seen somebody else have a heart attack like that during a marathon, and it was the same reaction. And that person unfortunately died. And I was just stunned to watch it. But the news is coming out, which is great. But more important, just in a world that where we see so much animosity and anger, and it's been a tough few years with the pandemic and with politics, and what's happened in Buffalo is just amazing to see a community come together like yours has. That's been very impressive. Tom, back to your question, should risk your life at the end of the day? And I was thinking about this kind of this afternoon as I knew this would be a topic. The first point I would make is it's not just football at all. And especially in what happened here, this happens sometimes in baseball. It has happened in lacrosse, a direct hit to the chest. And what's shocking about this is I understand it's 20 milliseconds of where this can happen, where the heart has relaxed and you get hit at the right time, at the right angle, at the right moment. And it can cause the heart arrhythmia or heart attack and ultimately death. So I look at this slightly different than maybe the concussions and some of the other things, that sports is inherently has some danger to it. Nobody expects to die from it, but it happens. And everybody from the medical personnel and the prep work that they do to the safety equipment, everybody is trying to do and be smart about it. But athletes at the end of the day do have to make personal choices about putting their body at risk. And this kind of reminds people sometimes that the risks are much higher than I think anybody anticipates or really thinks about. This is certainly a dangerous sport, but it's not the only one. Knock on wood, Tom, you know my daughter, right? She plays very high level lacrosse and field hockey. And God forbid it would ever happen, but it has happened on the lacrosse field. And you continue to see it. And we have to take appropriate safety measures, but you can't just stop playing. I just went and picked up another daughter at school and drove across town, and that is way more dangerous than the sports. At the end of the day. And so I think we have to keep it in relative perspective. And it's more important about how prepared are we, in my view.
I'd like to turn to leadership because I know, Lisa, you had some thoughts on that, and you mentioned the leadership of the Bills coach, Sean McDermott, but also the leadership we saw from the Bengals coach, Zach Taylor. What did you see from those individuals or perhaps others around leadership literally in the moment?
I want to say one thing that I didn't say before that I think is important. I think another person who deserves some real sympathy and understanding is T. Higgins. I think it's been when people sit and think this could have been him or blamed him, he has done nothing other than play the game, and that Damar Hamlin's family and others. I just think I wanted to mention when we talk about leadership and doing some of the right things, I think everybody has acknowledged that is a point of significance and has fought trolls and others who come up with other things. But I
And
think the
Lisa, I think that's a really important point, because what I loved is that the Bills fans stood up and helped protect him and say what was happening online, it's not fair. Even Hamlin's family came out and said, please don't do this. It wasn't his fault. This was a fluke accident that happened. And this is not how you treat other people. And that's a great educational leadership moment for everybody to understand.
Yeah, I mean, that there's so many things that came in this world of seeing people do the right thing. The players, one thing I thought was remarkable that I wouldn't have understood at the time, shocking no one on this call. I did not, never played competitive football, but with watching the players know, not only looking at their faces, you said, seeing instinctively what went wrong, but that they went to protect him and the medical care and thought, I don't want anyone seeing what happened. And at the time, as someone who wasn't aware, didn't realize they may have thought somebody that he may have passed, how serious it was, but they protected one another. And then what I also thought was remarkable was in that confusion with the way both coaches communicated with one another. And they really did put the players and the health and the safety, obviously, of Damar Hamlin first and foremost. And I think it says a lot about making sure in all situations you remember your protocols, your emergency exits, CPR, things like that. They were trained, and that may have saved this young man's life. But also the way the teams, seeing the captains go to one another, seeing them as two teams together, supporting them, and the people in the field, the spectators, the people there. Nobody was wondering what would happen with the game. No one, everyone was supporting one another for what would happen next. And I think that showed a lot in a world And also in a situation where we didn't know exactly what was happening with the NFL and others, I really do believe those coaches went out and said, we care about these players and these teams more than the NFL or anything else at that point. It's about our people. And I think that's a leadership lesson for all of us. I think the NFL got a little confused in the middle. I know we'll talk a little more about that, but I thought the way you saw that, you really have seen the best of humanity. And that really did come from those coaches. And that can be a lesson to all of us in ethics and compliance, is how doing the right thing really does come out in the end.
Stephen?
No, I agree with that. Another example was the Bengals players going to the Bills players' locker room in mass to support them during this. And I have no doubt, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes, but I have no doubt had the NFL decided to try and play the game, all of the players on both teams would have said, as they should have. And when we talk about leadership, the NFL at the end of the day did the right thing, but the coaches were going to step up. And if they didn't, the players certainly would have. And so it's the same thing when we talk about ethics compliance. If the CEO, he or she's not willing to step up, or somebody else in the organization, senior leaders, then the compliance officer needs to, or the individual employees do, or whoever is going to take those stand and do the right thing. And to me, that was a perfect example of people coming together, supporting each other, and making the right decision. And if somebody would have made a different decision, they would have stood up. There's no question. And that's what we all have to do in the corporation, especially as compliance officers like we are, but also just as regular employees, to make sure our organizations are always doing things the right way in tough circumstances with uncertain facts. In a stressful situation, that's when bad decisions get made, and you have to try and keep as level head as you can and really work through it. And if you see leaders not doing that, then it's your obligation to step up and do the right thing.
So let's move to the NFL, because I was very disturbed by what happened in real time and what they've said after. And that started with when Joe Buck and Troy Aikman, the announcers on ESPN, announced there'd be a 5-minute warm-up period, and then they start the game. And I couldn't believe that. Now, they were relayed that information from someone. ESPN has said it was their rules analyst who was in contact with the NFL. And I know, Lisa, you have some thoughts on the process. But what I saw after that announcement was made and the Bills quarterback started to warm up was the Bengals coach, Zach Taylor, go across the field and talk to Zach Taylor in the presence of the referees. Now, Taylor has now said in a press conference, when he got across the field, Sean McDermott said, I need to be with my player. I need to be with Hamlin. I can't do this. And I think those coaches then and there made the decision, we're not. Now, I know they left the field, and I know there was some time later, but I think you guys are absolutely right that the coaches stepped up. There's been no confirmation of that. The NFL said they initiated some sort of emergency protocol, yet it was till 1 a.m. the next day that they suspended the. First of all, I think it's absolutely an outrage that it took that long for this emergency protocol to be not only activated, but a decision made, because the decision makers were the league and the players. So that means the Players Association and Roger Goodell. I don't believe the NFL when they said they didn't say, but we're going to start in 5 minutes. They don't have a lot of credibility with, but to the absolute of each coach, they stopped the game and they went into the locker rooms. But Lisa, you had some other thoughts about the process that were a little different. What did you see in terms of process that led to the announcement by ESPN and then the players leaving the.
One of the things that I saw, and that's not aspiring good or bad intent, but I think it is a definition of when you come up with a process on paper and you have mid-level people who aren't going to ask any questions about it, and the senior people aren't stepping in and giving information. I think it's very possible that both things were true. And it is a problem we see. The management, the leadership, we're all talking to each other, the heads of the NFLPA checking on safety, and somebody who said, this is what we do, this is my job. It's the difference when we talk about the difference between ethical decision making and following a policy word for word. I don't know for sure, but I think there may have been some of that was going on at the same time, along with all of the regular chaos that happened. And the other thing I do just want to jump in and say is, what a great message. The older I get, the younger I realize football players are, but what a great message for them to see that their coaches said, we have your back as opposed to trying to make more money, regardless of what happened. This is something that can impact lots of people's lives. But I do think there may have been two levels of communication, because I think I see that sometimes the difference between actions and the leaders not speaking quickly enough to the more junior folks. What about you all? Stephen, what about you?
Yeah, to me, it's an interesting one because when I saw it, obviously we didn't have full information, and the NFL, I don't think had full information. You're talking about a unprecedented issue happening on the field in real time, right? And you could see the reactions. And to me, it was one of those things, and I agree with you, Lisa, is that they couldn't make the people at least didn't feel empowered to make the decision on the field. It had to go to the NFL headquarters. It had to go to Goodell, the Players Association. You probably emergency calls. All that's moving in real time, and we don't really know what's happening with the player at the end of the day. And who knows who may have suggested they're going to warm up and play, but that would have been the normal protocol if somebody had injured a knee or, God forbid, there was a spinal cord injury, because you see it a lot, right? And they take the player off the field and they resume, and that's the normal protocol. In this situation, it was so extreme that it was outside of what normally was in the process or the policies or what the setup was. And so nobody knew how to handle it. And it took too long. There's no question that it took too long at the end of the day. I'm not going to subscribe to the NFL that they were being heartless. I think they cared about the player. I think somebody may have communicated that it was, we're going to go back and play once the player is off the field and on the way to the hospital, without really understanding the significance of the situation. I think there's no question that the coaches came together and said, we can't play this game, and the players absolutely we're not going to play, and maybe that changed the mind. But my takeaway from it was you have to be prepared for situations that you've never faced before, and that's when you show how well you do at crisis management at the end of the day. And some people handled it that night better than others did. It took a little too long for the decision to be made through the NFL, but it was, in fairness, it was complicated. It was a serious medical situation, but nobody knew exactly what happened. Your Goodell and D. Smith and some of the others from the Players Association, nobody's there. They don't know what's happening. They're trying to figure it out in real time too. And it was unfortunate across the board. My immediate reaction, your immediate reaction, everybody's was they can't possibly play this game. And that is where it ended up. It just should have been a little bit faster in terms of communication. The 5 minutes to go warm up, if the NFL said that, was a mistake, there's no question. But we'll never know how that played out. But to me, the takeaway is that this is a perfect example of why you've got to have a chain of communication and a emergency protocol for situations you just didn't anticipate. And now they will have a protocol for this specific situation. God forbid it ever happens again. But I try to look at it in a situation where it was so chaotic that there were just so many moving parts and people having to make decisions that weren't there in live time, that, again, it's back to leadership. The coaches were there. They saw what happened and they said, we're not playing. Right. And I think that got communicated up. You saw both coaches in the tunnel later talking on the phone to the NFL. I don't know whether it's Goodell or whoever, and it was pretty clear they were both saying, we're done here. Right. This is where the teams cannot play. And that was definitely the right decision. To me, it's being prepared, communicating as much information as you can, and doing it in a efficient manner. We all know corporations and situations can take way too long to think through things and too much discussion, especially when you're faced with a critical situation.
I want to take that point, Stephen, and turn, however, to ESPN. And I'd like us all to maybe talk about how we felt ESPN handled that. But from the compliance perspective, what I'd like people to understand is this was a catastrophic injury to an NFL player, yet a third party, albeit a close related party to the NFL, was also caught up in this. So, what does it mean when you're so embedded or entwined with a customer, with a third party, with a joint venture partner, that if something happens to them, it can be catastrophic to you as well? So, we had the two announcers, Joe Buck and Troy Aikman, have been paired together for nearly 20 years. They're trying to describe what they're seeing with no information in the. Then ESPN cuts away to the corporate headquarters, and here they have the announcer. Then they have two experts: one, a former player, Booger McFarland, and two, their number one NFL guy, Adam Schefter. McFarland, to me, clearly did not want to be there and did not want to have to talk. He was so upset, and he completely spoke from the heart, and it was as passionate a words as I thought could have been given. Schechter was a little more withdrawn because he's not a former player, but he was also very passionate. I thought ESPN handled that about as well as they could. But it made me think, how when you're that intertwined with someone and something happens to the other party, should you be ready for an emergency? So I was wondering how you guys felt about ESPN, their role in this. Of course, they were the ones who announced the 5 minutes. What did you think about ESPN and their role and how they handled it and what it means to be so entwined with a client, customer, or third party that if catastrophic event happens to them, it happens to you as well?
It's a good question. Lisa, you want to take the first shot or you want me to?
Happy to. I actually thought that ESPN did a very good job. I think Susie Colbert, as the moderator, was really also at times was very human. We don't know what to say. We are watching this. It was clear that we're staying here because we don't know what else we're supposed to do. And I think that there are always going to be catastrophes that you're not going to be prepared for how to talk about or how to address, whether it's with a close customer or with someone else. But I will say that I do think the fact that they've stood their ground with the NFL saying we were given this information when they're one of the NFL's largest, as you said, but I do think that in some ways they acted more independently than you would have hoped. And they were all human beings during this. With Booger McFarland, the other person I thought was excellent was Ryan Clark when he was on Scott Van Pelt afterwards, we talk about this in a whole different way. And Dominique Foxworth the next day went on and said, when we fight for the rights of players and why they should get paid more, this is an example why. It's not just greed. It's the majority don't have protection after their careers, and there are dangerous things that happen short term and long term. So I really thought that I thought they did the best job they could. And I also think the reality of it is you're always going to be intertwined with certain large customers or corporations. Are you independent at the moment?
And are you willing to step up and separate yourself from that partner if necessary, or criticize them, or suggest to them they need to improve their processes, or you would have expected them to handle it different and be able to address those things going forward? I think that's absolutely a critical part of it.
Stephen, did you have any thoughts on how ESPN handled it as a news organization?
Yeah, look, I think they handled it. I'd agree with Lisa. I think they handled it as well as they could given the set of circumstances. I think they, like everybody else, was unprepared and they continued to try and provide the audience as much information as they could. It was obviously very limited, but they were speaking from emotion and talking about what's the real impact. And all of us, look, could they have cut away and put on some previous show, some sporting event or something? Yes. Would that have been a good idea? No, because we all would have been trying to find as much information as we could. So the fact that they stayed live, continued to try and discuss it in a very challenging environment, I think was great for all of us that were trying to understand what had happened here. And the thing that's interesting is it is very curious as to, did ESPN get good information and provide that to the audience when they said there's going to be a 5-minute restart? Did that really come from the NFL? And if so, who made that call and that decision? Because that seems more problematic to me. But if ESPN also didn't really get a good source and have it verified, then they made a mistake in real time, right? And they were just trying to pass on information quickly. And to me, that's one takeaway, which is if you don't verify information in a critical or emergency situation before you relay it to others, you could see the problems that were going to happen. And we can debate whether we think the NFL did or didn't do it. Certainly, at least I think Joe Burrow was warming up on the sideline. Potentially that had been communicated to the players, but it could have come from somebody in the stadium too. It could have come, who knows where it was coming from. But that's the one piece of information that it's at the time, it may have not seemed as critical, but it certainly was, that you'd want to verify and make sure that's what's happening before you report it to a bigger audience. And as compliance officers, like when you're doing investigations or you're trying to figure out information, before you communicate what would be a factual basis, make sure you verified it.
So I'd like to just end with some final thoughts that each of us have in this. And Lisa, I guess back to you. Where are you today and how do you feel now?
The most important thing is I am so happy to hear that Damar Hamlin is doing better. I have to say, I got a kick out of his first question that he wrote down, which is, did we win the game? Which was, we won it life. I'm so inspired by the way that the community, as Stephen said before, has stepped up, and in all over the country. I will say now that I'm a Bengals fan. If the Bills aren't there, I have some others I like, but what they did was extraordinary. So I feel hopeful. I can't help care a whole lot less about home field advantage than I would have if I had this conversation a week ago. Care about anything else. No matter what, to me, the Buffalo Bills are true champions this year for everything they did for the community and what they've been through. And now this. And I guess the only thing I'd say is we're all here for three. And what I got to say, go Bills.
Stephen?
Look, I would agree with obviously with Lisa that the best thing coming out of this is Damar Hamlin's, medical prognosis at the moment and the fact that he's awake and responding. And they're talking about neurologically that everything seems to be intact, which is just amazing given the situation and what we saw on the field. And that's just by far the best thing that possibly could have come out of this. And I agree, we care so much about sports that at the end of the day, home field advantage doesn't matter as much as that young man hopefully making a full recovery, regardless of whether he ever plays football again or not. But so thankful because I will tell you that night, I did not think we would be in the situation today where we were hearing that kind of news. And that's just amazing. The second part is how communities came together. People standing outside in the hospital that don't know him, that come from both teams, that were there to support him, to all the support that's coming to Buffalo now, to the charity that he'd started. He wanted to raise $2,500 for his mom's daycare for kids that needed things. And last I saw, they'd raised like $6 million, right? Just phenomenal. What we can do as a community when we come together, regardless of politics, regardless of race or nationality or anything else that you could possibly think of that seems to divide us these days, that when something like this happens, it shows really the true spirit, both in our country and in the world, that we can do things the right way. I think that for the Bills, I hope this drives them to the Super Bowl because that would be an amazing outcome here. And they go on and win this thing because they'll be doing it certainly for Hamlin and certainly for the Buffalo community and everything they face this year. So I'll be cheering for the Bills throughout the playoffs. It was a very difficult situation and it was a miraculous kind of outcome here. And we can look at it from leadership and compliance and there are great lessons to be learned. But at the end of the day, it's really the human spirit and all of us coming together, which I wish we would learn a lot more because we can't even figure out at the House of Representatives now how we can have somebody representing our country. So it'd be nice to get back to a little bit more civility in a lot of these things and show what the power of positive energy does in the world.
So I want to pick up on, I think, Lisa, you mentioned, and that was the Bengals quarterback, Joe Burrow. He's 24 years old, and he's been one of the true leaders that came out of this. Started on the field when he and others were circled around with the Bills. He led the Bengals team to the Bills locker room to just support the Bills players at the stadium. And when he was, what did he think should happen with the game? Should it be postponed? Should it be canceled? Should it be rescheduled? His response was, we're going to do whatever Buffalo wants because we want to support them. And I thought that was one of the best statements of every emotion you guys just articulated.
Yeah, Beck Taylor said the same thing. He's a good Midwestern Nebraska guy coming out, and that's what you should do. In times of emergency or times when people need support, you just do it. The rest of this doesn't matter.
Lisa, I wanted to thank you for joining us on this somewhat somber and bittersweet podcast, but something that I know you're very passionate about and Stephen and I wanted to talk about. So thanks so much for joining us, and hopefully we will see you again at some point after the Super Bowl.
Love it. And again, go Bills.
Go Bills.
Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Sports and Compliance. I hope you'll join Stephen and I again in our next episode. As it's our first episode of 2023, if you have ever thought about being on a podcast or starting a podcast, I hope you will consider either coming on a Compliance Podcast Network show or posting your podcast on our network. Either way, if you'd like to be on a podcast or you'd like to talk to me about starting a podcast, please email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. Sports and Compliance is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.